Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories.
We're your hosts, Dr. Caitlin
and Dr. Randall,
two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us.
The show will cover worldwide mythology, and season 1 will focus on ancient Greek stories,
giving listeners everything they need to know to understand the new Netflix series Caeneus,
and most likely several things that they don't. Join us as we talk, laugh, and sing this fall for The Mything Link season 1.
Chaos
Theory. You can link that up. It's appropriately chaotic. This whole situation is appropriately chaotic. Maybe that's it. It's a lesson in chaos. Perfect.
It's a lesson in chaos theory.
Let's start at the very beginning. A very fine place to start. When we spell, we begin with A, B, C. A is for Amazon, and that's what we're doing today.
Perfect. Do, re, mi.
Oh, I'm so glad to be back. I'm so glad to do this with you.
Yeah, I missed you.
I missed you. This week, we are looking at the Amazons, and our content warning, we're going to be discussing themes of rape, gender identity, queer violence, death, and military violence in general. So be prepared. So I feel like oftentimes, okay, this is a sweeping generalization, but I'm just going to make the claim. I feel like a lot of the people I talk to, their first thought when they think of the word Amazon is not ancient Greek mythology, right? It typically oscillates between the company Amazon or the Amazon River and Rainforest or the comic book connection, right? So there's so many different associations, but they all come to us from these original ancient Greek Amazonians. So I think it's really fun that Chaos included them. I would say obviously in mythology circles, I don't think they're overlooked, but in public discourse about ancient Greek mythology, I think they're often overlooked figures. So I'm pretty excited to have done some research on them and that we get to talk about them today.
Yay.
Yay. And this is our first time recording since winter break. And it's so lovely to see you.
It's good to see you too. I'm happy to be here.
So the Amazons are a group of female warriors in ancient Greek mythology. And they, as a female group, they practice matrilineal descent practices, which means that they track their ancestry through their mother as opposed to their father. The Amazons, I think, are really unique figures within Greek mythology because a lot of contemporary sources from ancient Greece at the time seemed like they believed the Amazons were real functioning people. It seems like it was a little bit more of a kind of fear of the unknown or fear of other cultures, a little bit of that racism is a strong word, but right, a little bit of the fear of the outsiders. And one of the articles I read, I pulled this quote I really, really liked from the McGee article that I'll link in our show notes. The Amazons project onto foreign soils tensions felt in the home society and provide a safe sphere for the expression and resolution of those tensions. So
I like that.
Right? And that was just in their abstract. I was like, heck yeah. The interesting thing is that these Amazonians were seen as living kind of in the far off, misty borderlands of the geographic region. So just this kind of general, outside of the Mediterranean, there lies these distant lands where these female warriors reside. And people made up stories about them. I would assume maybe functioning in a similar way as Sparta did to that region at the time, right? Shrouded in mystery and steeped in legend. So this is one of those things where we're not sure if there really were a tribe of female warriors or not that it was based on, but who knows? So the Amazons are a race of people, and tracking that matrilineal descent, they have the first mother of the Amazon culture, and her name is Otrera. Questionable pronunciation, per usual. Otrera was the first Amazon queen, and she was the daughter of the god Ares and the nymph Harmonia.
how they reproduce is that they, once a year, they fuck a man and they become pregnant and they keep the daughters that they raise in their close society of warrior women, and then they send any sons back to their fathers.
Okay, we ready for etymology corner?
Ready for etymology corner, man.
Yo, Amazon, A being the Greek prefix meaning without, mazos, Mazos in Greek, means breast. So they were literally referred to because they cut off their right breasts so they wouldn't get in the way of their shooting their bows.
Shooting their bows, yeah.
I had no idea. I'm so glad we're doing this episode.
That's so interesting.
So that is where the etymology of their name comes from and what they were known for.
Damn.
So they were just known as like those one-breasted women who are so extreme, and this statue behind me shows
one boob,
breast like kind of missing there. And you know, they're already living like kind of on the borderlands, on the boundaries outside of mainstream society. They're not fitting into typical gender norms. They're mutilating their body, so they are essentially taking away half of their femininity, right? And they were commonly depicted as really, really tall, like abnormally tall, abnormally strong, abnormally courageous and warrior-like, all of these attributes that would be typically ascribed to the masculine heroes at the time. And the lens of the storytelling of the Amazons is so clearly through the patriarchy. So even though we're seeing these like strong women from a matrilineal society and a matriarchy instead of the patriarchy, we're still seeing it. They're not the stories the Amazons are telling of themselves, right? They're the stories that the outsiders are telling of being scared or threatened by such a different way of life, a different approach to gender identity, a different approach to social structure and hierarchy. It's still showing men as the default and saying that for the women to use these weapons, they need to mutilate themselves to be more like men. The extremism in that women can't necessarily be these strong warriors without mutilating themselves to be more like men is still showing the male body as the default, as the preference.
I'm thinking about that in context to gender performance in Greco-Roman society. I talk about this as the sliding scale of masculinity, Greco-Roman antiquity. They didn't have, gender binary. They had this sliding scale that was constantly in flux and motion. Every performance and way that you inhabited your body determined if you were closer to manly or unmanly. And so it's fascinating to think about where the Amazons would have fit in, because the whole penis-owning body was also a really big signifier of performing masculinity in the expected way. And so the idea that they're cutting off their breast, it does in a certain sense make them more masculine, but also simultaneously bars them from being manly and moving up that sliding scale. They'd honestly have probably been considered pretty manly. They were free, as in they weren't slaves. They had sexual autonomy and power, exemplified by their reproductive practices, and they were successful warriors. I don't know how being mutilated to be more manly would affect their position on that sliding scale, because the whole male body was the ideal, but mutilation also marred manliness.
They're subverting the expectation. They're like actively mutilating it and pushing it away and saying like, fuck your gender norms. I have autonomy over my body and I'm going to be this warrior. Like all ancient Greek myths, like the Amazons really exist in this tension of opposites where they're totally badass and also totally unacceptable by today's cultural norms and standards. And so much so that there's a whole horror movie franchise that's based on the Amazon story, arguably, called The Wicker Man. Oh my God, you've never seen The Wicker Man? Okay, so The Wicker Man is this movie, I believe it's from the 50s, the original one, and I think there were sequels to the original. The remake of it came out, I want to say in the late 90s or early 2000s, starring Nicolas Cage, and it's shown as a horror story. So spoiler alert, if you haven't seen The Wicker Man and you're interested in seeing it without a spoiler, fast forward. Essentially, it's told from the main character is Nicolas Cage, from his point of view, that he gets married and he has a baby. and he gets in like a car accident, and his wife and daughter are gone out of the car. And he's told like basically that they never existed, and he thinks he's going crazy. And so he tries really hard to find them, and he eventually does, and finds out that they're living on this island, and realizes essentially that it's like the Amazon scam, that he was like chosen for his good stock to father a child, and he thought that this woman really loved him, but she was just pretending, and took the kid and went back to their matriarchal island where they keep bees and they live in harmony and they don't tolerate any men. It's like literally textbook Amazon society. And
why is it horror?
And it's shown as a horror movie because Nicolas Cage is the central character, and it's the one who the things are happening to. So you're supposed to sympathize with him being bamboozled and hoodwinked and being told that his wife never existed. And then it turns into like a Midsummer situation where Nicolas Cage turns into the sacrifice. Turns out they've got to like sacrifice a man in this big giant burning wicker man effigy.
Oh.
So then he has to like escape from the island, and it kind of turns into this like get out situation where he thinks that his wife is like being held against her will, but turns out she's part of the plot the whole time or whatever, and she doesn't love him. He's just a wiener to procreate. Reading about the Amazons and researching, that's like literally my note on the second line. I'm like, oh my God, this is the Wicker Man. Okay, I wanted to go back to the etymology and talk a little bit more about the versions of the Amazons that we kind of know today of the word, right? So a lot of folks think of Amazon the company when we hear the word Amazon, and Amazon the company got their name not from the Greek warriors, but from the Amazon rainforest, because just like in the Amazon rainforest, at Amazon Marketplace, you could find everything under the sun from A to Z. And that's why it's not a smiley face under their logo. It's a little arrow that points from the A to the Z. Going on a journey through the Amazon rainforest like helps you find unexpected delights, just like in their marketplace. And the Amazon rainforest, the region and the river in South America, are named after the Amazon warriors by Francisco de Orellana. In 1541, he was a Spanish soldier, and he reported that he had like an altercation with these big Amazonian warrior women. This is an instance of like an outsider European naming this place for like the exotic fears that they hold about what the world holds outside of their region. So all roads lead back to the Amazonians. So in Chaos episode 3, we meet Hippolyta and the Amazons. And in episode 6, we get the background of the Amazons, that they cast away boys when they become men. And so in the Chaos version of the mythology, they don't just immediately give the babies to the dads to keep them out of the society. They consider children kind of like gender neutral. And then when they hit that point of puberty, they cast out the boys and kill them if they return. I thought this was like a really violent way to portray the Amazon culture, and arguably, right, ancient Greece story, ancient Greek myths are just full of violence. And so this is accurate to the source material, but it just felt like a little extra that once the boys go through puberty and become men, they're cast out and killed if they return, and they can't have any ties to the society that raised them. And arguably that feels more cruel to me than getting rid of them as babies and putting them up for adoption or whatever, unless they're like leaving the babies on top of a mountain or whatever, a la Sparta.
The way the Amazons are depicted in Chaos would not align with the feminist platform, right?
Absolutely.
And that bothers me personally. But also I think it gets at something deeper, which is that every person deserves to be respected and valued for who they are. And we've talked about this a number of times. Flipping from the patriarchy to the matriarchy, it's just women playing into the patriarchy, or it's just as fundamentalist as it's just flip-flopping fundamentalisms. What I appreciate that they're getting at with this, or at least what I think they're getting at with this, is that any society that doesn't respect people is unjust. just because it's doomed to fail, right? And just because it's a matriarchy doesn't make it any different in that.
Well, they're calling it a matriarchy, but it's like it's on the patriarchal structure and framework, right? Because like think of so many patriarchal societies and the idea of like bride price or a dowry or something like that, right? The expectation is when a girl becomes a woman, she leaves her family and goes to serve her husband's family. And this is the opposite, where when the boys become men, they're expected to leave and there's violence if they return. And it's interesting, the violence is perpetuated by the matriarchy upon the return of the men, when in our patriarchal culture, the violence would likely be perpetuated by the outside society if a woman tried to escape and go back to her family home, right? Like that idea of not living up to your expectations as a wife or fulfilling that role or whatever it is, you would likely be punished by your husband or the society that you're currently living in if you tried to make it back to where you came from.
Don't they in Chaos, Caeneus is actually sought out and killed by the Amazons?
Yes. So in Chaos, Caeneus's mom's prophecy foretold a boy, so she was relieved when she gave birth to a girl. They explain all this in episode 6, but of course there's no mistakes in prophecies, and it turns out that Caeneus is trans and grows from a girl into a man instead of into a woman, and so therefore Caeneus can no longer be accepted as part of the Amazons. And his mom is trying to, I mean, a huge commentary on gender and living who you are and being out with your full self. His mom says the form doesn't really fit the content, does it, when Caeneus comes out to her? And I thought that was a lovely response, an understanding response, and knowing this tragedy is going to unfold, just like the prophecy foretold that she does have a boy, and she's always had a boy who was able to camouflage himself to stay home, but couldn't stay in the closet forever, and eventually has to grow his wings and be himself. Oh, we can't talk about it. But in Chaos, my next, very beautiful, and then my next note is Riddy and Caeneus getting it on while Orpheus is stumbling through the underworld is a wild contrast.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert.
I thought about that too.
That was so interesting. And the way they portrayed Caeneus and his importance in the myth. Do you want to talk a little bit about Caeneus?
Caeneus is one of my personal favorite Greek mythological characters, probably because I love talking about queer anything. In Chaos, Caeneus is played by Misha Butler, who identifies as a trans man, which I think is perfect.
Finally, representation.
I know, and that's part of why I love Caeneus and Riddy getting it on in the underworld, because we're having this trans romantic representation in media, which I think is really beautiful and oftentimes overlooked, you know.
And it's a queer love story where the focus is on the love, not the queerness.
Right, exactly. And there's no big, what? You're trans? Like, it just...
Right. There's no big reveal. It's not about coming out of the closet. It's just,
you know,
it's
Riddy
told as if it's
Caeneus,
a normal part of society. And
which is, ooh,
I know, I just got the chills. There's such beauty and power in that.
It. There is such beauty and power
in normalizing these experiences. And there's so many, just showcasing and celebrating queer love instead of the pain and the difficulty of queerness.
Right. I loved seeing the trans representation and having a romantic lead who was trans, and it's, you know, everything we just said. I really loved that. It was just like a normative part of the show, and we need more of that. We need more queer normative things in media and books, and to stop treating queerness as this thing that's other, you know, like
queerness isn't other.
No, and we have like,
it's statistically significant in the human and animal population.
And I mean, like, even what I'm going to keep talking about, like gender fluidity, it's a big part of history. It is documented going, I don't even know how far back in history. It's just part of the human experience. It's part of the lived experience. It didn't
enter in. It didn't become popular at some point. Like it just always
it just is. It just is. And I love that Chaos acknowledges that. It just is. The story of Caeneus in Greek mythology, I think the most widely known version of the myth is in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is not shocking because it seems to be our staple text for everything. This is another example of like a dual narrator. So we have Ovid through Nestor telling the story of Caeneus to Achilles and the other warriors, and Nestor also acknowledging that he's not a trustworthy source of information. Like, he acknowledges that he's told this story in the way that he wants to tell it, which I think is really interesting too. It makes sense to me because Ovid obviously has political reasons for writing what he does the way that he does. And I think,
Obviously.
oh my God.
So sorry. I'm so sorry.
Nestor admits that he's left details out because he prefers to tell the story a different way. And that's kind of amazing. Anyway, so the story in Ovid goes that there's a girl who's born Caeneus, and she's the fairest girl in all the land, and everybody wants to marry her, and she's pursued by all these suitors from all over the place because her beauty is so famous and everybody wants to be with her, but she's like, I don't want to get married. You know, she's her own independent woman. So she takes a stroll along a beach, a seashore somewhere, and I bet you can't guess what's going to happen next. Poseidon sees her, thinks that she's beautiful, and rapes her. So we have another instance.
I hate it.
I know. I can't even with all the rape. It's so hard and so difficult.
Yeah. Kings are going to exploit their power, right?
It's true.
It's so gross.
Gross.
I mean, what a statement on how nobody should have that kind of power in a society, because it only leads to this kind of nonsense.
Yeah. The text goes on to say that Poseidon is momentarily satiated of his passions.
Ew!
So, I know, it's gross. So then in that moment, he offers Caeneus to grant her a wish, whatever she desires. And she chooses, quote, the thing that will prevent her from suffering such injury again. So
God
she chooses...
Damn it!
She then asks Poseidon to turn her into a man. So she can never be raped again. It feels very almost parallel in a different way to the story of Medusa, because Medusa is turned into something that no man can ever rape again either.
And we have Daphne turning into a tree.
Right.
And we have Cyan turning into the waters. Like, I mean, this is over and over and over again. But then it paints trans people through this lens of trauma.
Right.
And I don't like that.
No.
Rude, Ovid.
Well, let me finish telling the story.
Okay.
So it tells that she's asking Poseidon to turn her into a man. The tone with which she uttered these last words was deeper. Such as suits a male, indeed she had become a man. So she does, even before she finished asking this, Poseidon's already turning her into a man. And with this transfiguration from she to he, Poseidon also grants that no iron weapon is able to pierce Caeneus's body. So fast forward, Caeneus is super renowned for his prowess in battle, and he's attending this wedding with Theseus, which we love us some Theseus. And Ovid then tells the story of the centaur Amyclae, because we love our Amyclaes, which is a war between the centaurs and the human. And at this wedding, one of the centaur men looks at the bride and drags her off by the hair to rape her. And basically what happens next is all the other male centaurs start grabbing women that they want and pulling them off to rape them. And obviously Theseus, as he should, has beef with this. And the original instigator he kills by smashing him over the head with a bowl, which I... is really ridiculous, but it all points to that Ovid is biased. He thinks that war is stupid and lacking artistry, so he communicates it as what it is. Stupid, egotistical, all those things. So during this battle, Caeneus is said to have killed 5 centaurs, and he's then challenged by a particularly fierce centaur who then dead names him. To put a modern term on it,
and dead naming, for those unfamiliar, is using the birth name of a trans person after their transition. And the idea is that doing so is intentionally not acknowledging their transition or the gender they identify as.
Thank you for defining that. So this centaur who is confronting Caeneus says to him, "Must I, O Caeneus, suffer one like you? For me, you'll always be a woman. You are nothing more than Caeneus. Yes, you seem to have forgotten that your origins were feminine. You don't remember what you had to do to merit this reward, the price you paid to earn yourself this false appearance of a man. Remember, then, just what you were at birth, what you went through. Now go, take up the distaff, that's your due. Take up the basket heaped with threads, the wool your thumb can twist. Let men attend to war." The centaur is mocking Caeneus, which obviously, as it should, infuriates Caeneus, and they do battle, in which, of course, Caeneus is fine because Poseidon has granted that no iron weapon can pierce Caeneus' skin. So the centaur is taking stabs at Caeneus and nothing is happening. And then Caeneus is like, "My turn." And he just like viciously stabs this centaur to death. And it's overkill. And so the rest of the centaurs charge Caeneus. And when they realize that they can't kill him with iron weapons,
They just rip him apart limb by limb.
They suffocate him to death. They heap like tree trunks and boulders on top of him and crush him to death.
The Giles Corey of ancient Greece? Wow.
There are two ways to understand what happened next. One is that Caeneus is never seen again. So he's either crushed into the underworld, or in some stories he transfigures and transforms into a bird and flies away.
Wow, double transfiguration for the same character?
Mm-hmm. I don't know what that means, but it's...
Dear God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far, far away. That's Jenny's prayer in Forrest Gump.
So he's also Jenny and Forrest Gump. He's embodying a lot of things here, which I think is the power of myth.
The power of mythology.
So I think there's a couple of key points that I want to make here, which is that Randall earlier was talking about how the Amazons are this projection of Greco-Roman fear, and the centaurs were another symbol of, in Greco-Roman literature, they're often a metaphor for barbaric behavior, violence, and they're seen as the antithesis of Greco-Roman civilization. That a prominent centaur is the one belittling Caeneus for his gender displays that Ovid, and Nestor in this case through the voice of Ovid, finds this kind of goading to be uncivilized, barbaric, and inhuman. So what I appreciate about this is that Ovid both doesn't shy away from topics of gender, also that he recognizes that gender isn't fixed, and gender is something to be respected. That is not something you insult someone with. You don't goad people by calling them the wrong gender and name. This is uncivilized. This is not how things are supposed to be. This is not just.
Right. And if it's an action that the centaurs are taking, the centaurs are half man, half beast. They live out in the woods and they like represent kind of like the worst, most bestial qualities of man. And so to have the centaurs be the ones doing the dead naming, I think is really powerful and would have held power during that time.
Absolutely. I also think it's a sad commentary on something that we still experience now, which is violence against queer bodies. It was as real then as it is now, and that's really tragic. It's also kind of tragic that after being raped, upon having this experience forced on Caeneus, she chooses to transform into a man to protect herself. In that she's dependent upon Poseidon's power, it is sad that this is how she sees fit to protect herself from future rape. This was her solution, right? But I also think it's an example of self-definition, right? Unlike most of the metamorphoses we see in Greco-Roman mythology, this is not a punishment. This is something she chooses for herself based on an experience that she has, becoming a he.
But arguably she chooses it's a trauma response still.
It is a trauma response.
So
it's this tension of Ovid is recognizing that myth and humans are fluid and there is agency in some metamorphoses, but also it's a tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the power that's held in a patriarchal society is to join the patriarchy, right? Like that's how you get power in an oppressive society. You join the side of the oppressor. And I think this is a great commentary on that that's the ultimate protection against being marginalized or oppressed as a woman is to become a man. And we see this throughout history where we wouldn't necessarily identify these figures as trans individuals, but even like the author George Eliot wrote under that pen name, so her work was taken seriously because people thought she was a man. And I know in my life with the first name Randall, I've enjoyed a little bit of male privilege when people read my name without meeting me. And like when I'm emailing back and forth with people, they treat me as if I'm a man.
I think that brings up an important point, which is the Caeneus of myth. It's really important, I think, that we don't call him a trans man, because trans is a personal identifier. It's necessary for someone to say, I am transgender, before anybody else can definitely call them that. So Misha Butler identifies as trans and has identified his Caeneus as trans. But this word transgender wasn't something that was used until the 1950s with the trans rights movement. I mean, queer people and queerness have always been a part of history and human experience. But I think it's a really powerful personal decision to say I am trans. So to me, it's hard for me to be like, Caeneus is a trans man, right? Because even if that's technically true in the terms of the word, in my
trans is a modern identity that it has cultural significance in this moment. And neither of us identify as trans. We're both cisgender. And so we're, of course, looking at this from outsiders and as mythologists and academics. But that's part of language, right? And identity. And we can speak to language and identity. So if you identify as trans and you have another opinion or something else you want to say about it, please contact us. We would love to hear and include your perspective.
Technically, it means to switch gender, so it's not wrong contextually in terms of etymology, but in terms of the historical, cultural context from which I'm speaking from, that's an important, powerful thing that a person gets to do for themselves coming out and how they identify. So I think it's a tricky tension to hold in this case.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that the creator of Chaos, Charlie Covell, identifies as non-binary and has gone on record saying that one of the reasons they're interested in Greek mythology is specifically because the myths are so queer. And I think that brings a lot of context to the way that the show handles these queer relationships and just queerness in general. It's really amazing to see queerness portrayed as something that's just normal human variation.
So queerness wasn't necessarily a word or concept that people talked about. That terminology doesn't really come into play until you have people like Michel Foucault who are reacting to the etymological history of the Catholic Church turning sex and bodies into something shameful in terms of rhetoric. That to say, people as fluid, metamorphosizing, not tangible entities is a historical truth between most cultures. I think I can confidently say that. The idea of calling them queer and trans and our association with those identities now from our historical context isn't how it would have been perceived at the time. So yes, Greek mythology is queer, but also this was the normative experience and storytelling of that time period. So they wouldn't necessarily have had that terminology or understanding of gender. I don't want to apply a modern word where it doesn't belong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we're absolutely looking at this through our modern cultural lens as white cisgender women who were raised in the United States during this specific time period. We unfortunately can't divorce our identities and our upbringing and our cultural experience and knowledge from the perspective that we bring.
I just want to be really clear about orienting myself as a cis woman in this historical epic.
And I think it's important to note, but I want to make sure we really highlight it, that in the traditional ancient Greek stories, Caeneus is not necessarily associated with the Amazons. That's something that chaos brought into the story to integrate and kind of do like a creative exercise. What would happen if a trans person was born into the Amazonian culture, a culture who is famously rigorous with their gender identity and acceptance?
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. That's
Yeah.
why we're doing these two together, not because they're associated in Greek mythology, but because they're associated in chaos.
Yes, absolutely. So in Chaos, it's the Amazons who killed Caeneus, and that's shown as part of the barbarism of them murdering him, is a commentary on their rigid approach to gender identity and their, I don't know, man, their inability to integrate DEI into their cultural
Yeah.
lexicon.
This is their equivocal plane crash.
Yes, yes. But we see the violence, and it's the Amazons and not the centaurs, but we still see that kind of like how inhumane it is, how monstrous it is, right? To have such rigid ideas about gender and not have an inclusive or equitable approach to allowing diversity in your community and in your society.
Any community that doesn't respect pronouns or gender identities or has really strict ideas of hierarchical relationships between genders is bound to result in violence. I think that is what Chaos is getting at.
Well, and I'm going to argue too, like from a broader, more zoomed out perspective, any society that doesn't embrace diversity is destined to fail. It's going to implode on itself, right? Because if we're looking at it from a biological perspective, diversity is what ensures success of your species, right? Because we're able to withstand different things and we're able to bring different skills to the table. And especially as like a human community, if everybody is a brain surgeon, you have nobody to build houses, you have nobody to cook food, right? Like it takes everybody, it takes all walks of life and all different skill sets in order to have a functioning society that has some sort of longevity to it, which of course is why empires end at around 250 years, because we are not embracing diversity. And we absolutely see that happening in the United States right now, actively, while there are plane crashes and people are losing their jobs and health insurance and all of these things. And it's being blamed on diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. So I'm not going to go on a political rant today because
I don't even
have time
understand
for that,
how those correlate in my, like, this is another example of me
non-white gay people equals bad. Bad equals society is going to destruct.
So much to unpack there.
Oh, so much to unpack there. Today, we are so excited to have Dr. Marissa Aro on the show. Marissa has her PhD in mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology, and she is currently working as an associate psychotherapist at Life Skills Awareness that's Southern California still considered, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, yes, yeah, great. In the armpit.
Mm-hmm. In the desert, deep in the desert. I primarily introduce myself as a mom of four because they're the best. Also, I think being a mom can also be extremely rewarding and exhausting. And I decided to do that while also going to school and getting my PhD and subsequent degrees after that. So we're at 6 degrees, which sounds really ridiculous to say out loud, but is factual.
We may as well just call you Kevin Bacon at this point.
Right.
Oh. Well, Marissa is here today to talk with us about the Amazons and the comic book kind of like DC connection. And in our PhD program, that's like one of the main things I think I knew about you before we became friends was your affinity for comics and heroes and pop culture. So what would you say that your favorite like superhero is?
Black Panther out the gate. He is my absolute favorite. Always has been. I will say I had a Thor phase. I did. But Black Panther stole the show for me. Still does. And I think part of the reason why is I appreciate his backstory and the land he's attached to, that I find camaraderie in as a very mixed and diversified individual. So it's almost like if I could choose a backstory for myself and like tell my children or their ancestry, I would say we're from Wakanda, but I can't. So
I mean, can't you?
Why not?
But they were like, yeah, we're definitely from Wakanda, like obviously.
I mean, the mythology of Black Panther is something that is super interesting. I don't have a ton of experience. Like, I didn't grow up with that character. I didn't really grow up with comic books in general. That just wasn't an interest area for me. But I did see the movie, and it was really powerful. And it felt the way that they explained and integrated the relationship between the living and their ancestors was something that really spoke to me.
The biggest piece that I took from being Wakandan was that there was a pocket of Africa that was completely protected from slavery. And instead of kind of falling to the wayside, they became this extreme, powerful country that has kind of pretended that they were incapable of protecting themselves and taking care of themselves, and had some of the smartest people in the world, some of the most valuable resources in the world. And as they walk around, in modern times, these beautiful fictional characters don't carry the burden or residue of slavery in their bloodstream, in the way they interact with other people. And it was something I found super duper interesting, because I am half Caribbean, half American. So my Caribbean side, they have this beautiful relationship with their skin, their culture. They aren't afraid, but they have a certain level of racism that they just kind of almost have had to learn and be beaten down to accept. Because when they first came to America, they weren't fazed by it. And then my mom's side, the American side, all of my cousins and aunts and uncles, they still carry it in their blood. The smallest conversation can get explosive purely based off of things that happened way before our time. So being 18 and learning about a character who could kind of walk in the middle, where they know racism is a thing, they're not necessarily affected by it, they don't think they're better than it all. I was like, oh, I can identify with that. They loved the way they looked, they dressed different, they spoke almost like a weird mixture of like an African dialect with a little bit of like British thrown in there. And I really just loved how it sounded and how the effort they put into it. And they kind of expanded my mind as far as what could be. And I think that kind of lent to the DC's idea about where like Wonder Woman came from, and what the Amazons were supposed to be, another population protected from certain historical factors. And so they don't have, those women don't have a lot of the fears or stigmas, because they didn't, these fictional characters didn't grow up with the stigmas that women in the real world do. So it's kind of like a mixture of taking a minority and giving them a way to fly without having the weight of history on them.
I really like that association, though. Like, the Amazons in both Greek mythology and in the DC universe are supposed to be like this matriarchal culture that exists outside of the confines of the patriarchy and their rules. Like, so also Wakanda exists outside or alongside the world of white supremacy and racism, right? Like, they're in a protected space, even though it's happening at the same time. Wonder Woman, our main like Amazon in the DC character universe, our like entry point to Amazon culture, her name is Diana. And Diana famously is the Roman version of the Greek goddess Artemis, who is the goddess of the hunt. She's frequently depicted with deer and bows and arrows, right? Yeah, in motion, absolutely. And also, for all intents and purposes, her character is described as what we would perhaps consider today to be asexual, right? She had no interest or aromantic in the ace umbrella. Of course, we can't talk to Artemis herself and see how she feels about her identification, but from all the stories that we know about her, she has absolutely no interest in anything. She's kind of a Katniss Everdeen figure. She's like very reluctantly participating in romance. And so Wonder Woman goes by the name Diana, and she's associated with the Amazons, which is purely, I believe, purely a DC construct. We don't see that in mythology. So who is Diana of the Amazons?
In the original text, Diana is the strongest of the Amazons in a long time, right? Because this is a society where they have young girls racing and, just doing all kinds of things to show their strength. A couple different confines of how they think, almost like IQ tests, things like that. And Hannah's just even as a small child ahead of all of them.
Kind of like a female Sparta.
Yes, kind of just throwing everybody off their groove. And it becomes apparent that she may be stronger than their queen at the time. She struggles because she becomes this pillar of perfection, and that is kind of like her crushing issue. And in the original text is just kind of looking for a way to help others and then not kind of be in trouble. She doesn't do it exactly right. It's almost like that pop reference right now that was going around where do you want to get saved by a superhero but then have to like get your house rebuilt? Right? Like
they'll save your life, but they'll destroy everything in the process.
Exactly. I will go in here and like save everyone, but whatever damages I can't be held responsible. And so that was like their first rendition. And then over time, again, there was the dark period of the 80s where she was more about being gorgeous, and it's less about IQ and it's about being pretty. And then we kind of loop back in the late 90s where she's beautiful and she's strong now. And she is kind of tricked by a male to leave her paradise island to go help. It's more like that, again, the Wakandan issue where they're now made aware of the issues happening in societies other than their own. And she's like, let's go help. We have the strength, we have the people, we have the armory, let's go help. And the leaders are like, you were not doing that. That's not our monkeys, not our circus. So she leaves anyway. And they're like, if you leave, you'll lose your strength, you'll probably lose your immortality. And she's like, but I'll be helping. And so she jumps ship and she tries to go save different parts of the world, but she's exiled and can never go home. Then the 2010s and whatnot, that storyline kind of continues where that character is allowed to, be beautiful, strong, but then I gotta go help the other. But now she's allowed to come home, at least occasionally. It's almost like that Pirates of the Caribbean reference where she can come home for like 10 years for like a day, but not necessarily stay on the island for extended periods of time. So
Persephone situation.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different renditions of Diana. It depends on just what storyline you're following. There's countless at this point, which is really, really awesome. But I think that her strength has always been that she is that strong and beautiful character. She is allowed to have that vulnerability, but she doesn't necessarily get pinned down by anything that the patriarchy stereotypically would kind of force on her outside of being stereotypically beautiful. She's had multiple lovers. She's never like been like married. Not
love that for her.
Right. She's adopted, I think once or twice, a random child and kind of had like a sidekick situation. But again, not necessarily nothing like stuck. Right. I feel like
interesting
in the comic book world, there's always someone who's like, well, let's just try the storyline and see what happens. So I'm sure at some point she got married or at some point had kids, but it's never really picked up any traction.
It's never been like a part of her character that's survived from
generation,
right, iteration, whatever it is.
Yeah. Her strength has stayed the same. Her beauty has stayed the same. And her ability to help those who can't help themselves has stayed the same.
So, I mean, obviously there's a huge importance in representation. And I think this is a good opportunity to talk about the concept of intersectionality. I don't think it's come up yet on the podcast this season, but this idea of intersectionality is that nobody has just one identity that is part of them. We all identify as a multitude of things, and oftentimes these identities intersect in ways that create the framework for our lives and how we go through society. And like my identities, I'm a daughter, I am a mother, I am a white woman, I am cisgender, heterosexual, and the way that I move through the world is informed by the intersections of all of those identities. And I'm thinking about like the intersectional identities in like representation of Black Panther. Like there's definitely really strong Black female characters, but in Wonder Woman and the Amazons, like they're a pretty white society, right? That representation would only be like for the female identity.
Yes and no.
Yeah, can you speak on that a little bit?
if you stay with the original documentation as far as the original comic books, yes, they are in general pale people from different kinds of paleness, though. They do try to
Oh, good. A diversity of whiteness.
Yes, a diversity of whiteness.
Perfect.
But they have been kind of tapped into over the years. Another pulp culture that, again, 18-year-old me just ate up the Twilight series when they became more visual. The movies came out and everything. They had to kind of integrate brown vampires. And part of that storyline, they integrated Amazonian women. They were brown. They were very, very brown.
In Twilight?
They were from the Amazons, yeah. In the final battle, they come out and save the day.
Are they from like the Amazon warriors of Greek mythology, or are they from like the Amazon rainforest?
They originally, from the books, they were like, oh, we're from the rainforest. Like that is our backstory. But in the movies, they lend to more of it. That they kind of got in trouble because of it. They kind of lent to that DC background. They probably shouldn't have touched anyway because we don't have permissions. But that was the hope. So everything from the way like they dressed and everything kind of lent to the DC version. And then when she got in trouble, they're like, actually, just kidding. We meant the rainforest.
How did I miss this? Caitlin, were you aware of any of this?
I had
in
no
Twilight?
idea. Nope. No.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to have to revisit that.
No, I definitely think that finding different versions of what beautiful can be and what beautiful is considered. Wonder Woman was considered more, the most beautiful person ever, but she wasn't very brown. A little chesty too.
A little chesty. Yeah. Very male fantasy.
Yeah.
Very American patriotic coded, which is interesting because I don't think the Amazons are supposed to have anything to do with America in the DC universe, right? Like they're not from the American continent. They're not fighting on behalf of America.
Yeah.
None of that.
She fell in love with an American. That was kind of her problem.
Who?
At one point, Diana has an American lover, which is why she's in America. At one point, there's a British guy thrown in there. There's an American.
At the same time as her American lover?
That would be interesting.
I'm
Who's writing that comic?
Who's right? Yeah.
That sounds like you are, Caitlin. What?
I was just going to ask if Marissa wanted to talk explicitly about her perspective of the Amazons in the comics.
What drew me to them originally wasn't actually them all being women per se. There is a all-female army in Wakanda. And a sign of that job title is they're bald, they shave their heads, they've got the spear and the whole thing. And the idea that the Amazons were these gorgeous female persons of different white backgrounds, all of their hair confused me because I actively, even before you can have like full-on film scenes, just conceptually, how are you kicking tail with all that hair on your head?
Right? What a sensory nightmare. I think of that all the time. I could barely eat a meal with my hair down, let alone fight the patriarchy with a sword.
I mean, I have my hair down now because I don't actively have twins in my arms, but my hair is on top of my head 90% of the time. How can you fight in battle with all of that hair? Then also they have this really interesting like gear setup in Wakanda where everything is kind of like threaded with magic science that keeps their clothes protected, but everything that you would consider to be vital is covered. But the Amazons didn't get the fancy gear. Like you got the fancy bracelet and like a belt, but like skin is exposed most of the time. So again, 18-year-old me was like, if I had to pick, I'm gonna go with full safety gear and a spear for long distance battle. This like face-to-face hand combat in a bikini thing made me a little nervous. But I did enjoy the concept. What I've also found really difficult with just kind of the background that DC kind of came with originally was that they were like not just fighting against the patriarchy. They don't like men. Like men were a problem just in theory. And so
Preach.
like and like
in
just
theory and practice.
Theory and practice. They were like, no, we don't want to deal with them. So what was Diana doing? Like, how did she just fall head over heels for this guy and like pretty much more or less give up her entire background for him. They've yet to give her a partner that I felt was worthy of her, which is part of the problem. Even still in the most recent comics, it still hasn't happened.
It feels very white male gaze-y to me, the way that they've portrayed the Amazon women in the comics. Like you're talking about, we've talked about before, in video games, men get a full set of armor and women are walking around in like Princess Leia from episode 6 bikinis.
Leia's slave bikini.
Leia's slave
Yeah.
bikini. Why? Why is that a thing? And in Greek mythology, the Amazon women were this like thing that was feared. There were these other that threatened the civilization and structure of Greco-Roman society. I feel like DC Comics tried to tame that and make them the epitome of the male gaze. And then they've tamed Diana so that she's walked away from everything that she's taught and valued to be with some mediocre white man. And that's like every male fantasy, right? Like, I mean, not every male fantasy, but that's
a standard, a standard male fantasy. I'm gonna pause us and explain the idea of the male gaze really quick for folks who are unfamiliar with that concept. And again, it's like an intersectional point, right? Where this idea is that so much of society is created by and for men, that men are perceived to be the audience of most media. And so it's created to appeal to their tastes or to their senses. And that's why we see, like, in video games, the male figures are like usually really strong, whether it's a physical strength or like a magical, like a magical dwarf with the potions and strength or something like that. It's part of this like male fantasy of who they wish they could be. And then the women are who they wish they could have. And there's not really any room there for the woman's point of view and how she wants to be or how she wants to move through the world. It's all created by and for men. And so when Caitlin was talking specifically about the white male gaze, that just takes it to that intersectional point of like, we live in, yes, a patriarchy here in the US, but it's also built on a system of white supremacy as well. And so we have that kind of like double dose of who these products and who these stories are written by and for, and it's to entertain white straight men.
Even to fact check, I have to double check, but I'm pretty sure that the DC creator for Diana based her off of the woman he wanted to marry, but could married somebody else. And so he was like, okay, I'm going to take the best attributes of my wife and the best attributes of my secret lover affair woman and put them together. And now I have a DC comic character. So it was like, he didn't even try to cover that one up.
Yeah.
And as someone who is also paradoxically a big hopeless romantic, I love a good story where you have to walk away from everything you've ever had in order to find love and be in love. But usually when I'm sitting there supporting it, that person is more or less worth it. At least it feels worth it. That's the whole point. And the fact that Diana's been around for how many decades now, and they still haven't found a partner that made it sound or feel worthy of leaving Paradise Island to be with, hasn't happened.
I want to tell you guys about a meme that I saw, that it was like,
So I'm ready.
Obviously men are the weaker species because they need all that full body armor in comic books, and women could get the same thing done with just a little bikini on. It just speaks to women's strength.
Yes. I fucking love that. It's so true.
Oh my
right?
God.
That was like such a recontextualization for me.
Sure.
Like, maybe it's not an exploitation.
Right.
Maybe it's because we just don't even need all that wussy shit. Just kidding.
I can cut this guy's head off with my big titties in a bikini, even though he needs a full fucking set of armor. Step aside.
Right? Male gaze who? I work better this way.
I work better. This is my
That shit is too heavy.
Yeah, right? Come on. Armor's got to be sweaty. Ew,
Ugh.
right? Gross.
Gross.
Okay. So Princess Diana, Wonder Woman, I'm on Wikipedia, so I can't speak to its accuracy, but it looks like the creator and his wife, they were in a throuple with this other gal.
No, but I wasn't sure. I heard that as well.
It says The art created by the American psychologist and writer William Moulton Marston, pen name Charles Moulton. Marston's wife, Elizabeth, and their life partner, Olive Byrne, are credited as being his inspiration for the character's appearance.
I have
1941.
complicated feelings about this.
1941.
It was a big deal.
This was just like not I was not expecting this conversation to go in this direction.
I'm
This
so
is
sorry.
really interesting. No, I mean, like, yeah, she was the polyamorous domestic partner of William Marston and Elizabeth Marston. This is amazing.
I love that, but also speaks to some of the problems that we see in the polyamorous community, which is couple privilege, white privilege, all those things. Again, those are very real, even amongst like people who identify as bisexual and thruples. You still have a lot of times it's the man who's saying, well, we can only ever have another woman involved, or the writer is in a throuple, which is like, good for you, fuck the binary, it's nonsense. But also he's still combining these super hypersexualized parts of his two cisgender white female partners.
Yeah, basically like dismembering them and remembering them into one like perfect amalgamation of what a woman should look like.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is not, it is skeevy. That's not polyamory. That's gross. Sorry. Big feelings about that.
No, yeah. Please have the feelings.
I love it, and also like cringed a little bit.
I love that there was an openly non-monogamous couple in 1941.
Me too.
I like that.
Me too.
That feels significant. And also, who knows? Were they a throuple? What did he just have two gals? Like, I don't know what their arrangement was. But it's really interesting because it feels like what you were talking about earlier, Caitlin, that like the DC universe kind of like tamed down the Greek myth of the Amazons. It feels like it's tamed down their warrior status, and then now it's entering this kind of land of lesbian porn adjacent stuff.
It was
right?
Paradise Island. I mean, that's not.
They live on Paradise Island. Come on.
That's what
it feels like. Another embodiment of the white male gaze, like I'm thinking specific. This is like a really dorky reference, but in The Office, where it's the gaydar episode that Jim buys the gaydar thing for Dwight, but it's a metal detector, and they're trying to figure out who's gay in the office, and Dwight and Michael are standing there looking out the windows, and Michael goes, Angela could be a lesbian. I could see her with another woman. And Dwight looks like this at the camera, like this really like skeevy turned on face, because he's Angela's the love of his life or whatever. And that's immediately what I thought. Like, what stereotypical straight white male fantasy is to watch two girls making out?
I get this image of the male fantasy of teenage girls or young women like on sleepovers, where we're all like in little tiny booty shorts and like matching little tank top lacy set, and we're like having pillow fights and squealing and our hair is done and all of that stuff, that's the male fantasy. And really we're all like wrapped up in our snuggliest sweats, and we're talking about magic,
ready to cut our boobs off.
right? Trying to do light as a feather, stiff as a board, or like getting into the occult and like Ouija boards. To be fair, we did used to use the Ouija board to ask it to give us the phone numbers of people who had a crush on us. But that idea of women in their own private woman only spaces are still performing on behalf of the male gaze, and that's what it feels like the DC universe has done to the Amazons, that when they're by themselves they dress in these little tiny boobalicious outfits and they look all badass and they're like always turned on, right? And there's that concept that after a woman gets married, she gives up and stops trying and lets herself go, quote unquote. And that's the male fantasy, is that even when women are not being observed by men, they're still, perfect and perky and performing, and they don't poop and they don't fart, and, they're surrounded by glitter or whatever. And that performance is the vibe that Wonder Woman and the Amazons in the DC universe give me.
Because the real function of the Amazons was, again, they were fearsome others who cut off their boobs and did all these masculine binary subverting things that jeopardize the status quo, and that is not the Amazons we see in DC Comics, in my opinion. I have feelings about the comic world. I was reading this thing. It was Marvel Comics, but without Stan Lee. So they took away all the words. The illustrator, he drew all these like scenes where like very obviously the woman is the protagonist and she's doing feminist things. And, you know, when Stan Lee went and filled in the bubbles, he made it all like super patriarchal and like dismissive of the women's actions and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that was my battle with comics for a long time and why I've really only collected specific. I am an Image comic person. I specifically read Image comics because I feel like they're pretty inclusive comparably. That's why I avoided Marvel and DC comics for a long time, is because I did not feel like they were intersectional. They felt very patriarchal, and you know, intersectional feminism is a really important thing to me. I think it should be important to everybody, but I wasn't going to spend money on things that are perpetrating like patriarchy and white feminism, you know. Yes, Randall.
How would you define intersectional feminism?
I was thinking about that when you were describing intersectionality earlier and realizing that I don't really know how I would define it, but how I would explain it to somebody who is asking me about it is I've read a lot of womanist theology and, you know, bell hooks and all of these really powerful BIPOC women writers who would say, I get paid less than a man at the same job. Being a Black woman, they'll look at your name and reject you just based on your name because it's not white sounding. Or like, I may get treated like shit and lesser as a white woman, but I was reading this one article that was written by a womanist theologian, and she was talking about historically, white women have been treated like objects, whereas in this case, Black women have been treated like chattel or animals. And there's a difference there because one gets treated like they're just there and not worthy of attention, and the other one actively gets called names like Jezebel and is treated really poorly. And that's the differentiation there. So like for me, third culture kid and being white results in a certain relationship with, you know, what feminism and like equality looks like getting for me, if you will. Whereas that's different for like my sister who's Chinese, and it's a matter of taking into account skin color and background and all those things. And, you know, acknowledging that as a white woman, I still have privilege because of my skin color that is not afforded to my sister. When I think of intersectionality, I think of not just the ways that all these identities correlate to each other, but those identities are treated differently by majority society, especially in the United States, where racism is a really unique structure that we don't see globally. Racism in the US is a really unique thing. And you can have racism in other places, but here racism is specifically built on a history of white supremacy and slavery. And that's lasted all this time. And so taking into account, yeah, as a white woman, I'm treated differently, but Marissa, you said my family carries this in our blood. I will never understand. I will never have that experience, right? Like I have a privilege that my bones don't carry that. So understanding the intersectionality of all those identities means how they affect people differently and how that affects how they take up space differently.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I like to kind of see it as like if feminism is a straight line that's intersecting all these different identities, it means that it's not just at our intersection of what our identities are and our experience that forms what feminism is, right? It's the needs and experiences of all those people at different intersections. And it's not just race and gender, it's also economic background. It's, do you have the support of your family or not? Is there a history of mental illness that you maybe grew up around or are experiencing today?
Sure.
Are you a parent? Are you like, do you have a relationship with your parents? What's your birth order? Did you have someone pay for you to go to college, or are you saddled with student loans? Like there's so many different intersections and needs, and women who are identifying as a specific race or as a parent or whatever it is are all going to have different needs at those intersections of what it means to be a woman.
I like the way that you said that.
Some of these intersections of our identities are out on display, like our race and our gender and oftentimes our sexual orientation. And sometimes we can take pieces of identity and pack them away, right? Like keeping your sexual orientation in the closet, or passing as a different race or religion or whatever it is in certain spaces. And those are privileges to move through spaces where your identity, or where one of your identities isn't the first thing that people notice about you, or that marks you as different or other. Right. And that's kind of like, to bring it back around, the magic that this idea of the Amazon culture holds, I think, for a lot of us as women, especially in the Greek sense, right? We see it in the comic books as being something that's kind of like on display and maybe fetishized and exploitative feminism, or, and right, like it feels kind of icky. But the idea of the warriors in ancient Greece, where there's a safe closed society of women and this matriarchy, like, I mean, look at the looks on all of our faces right now, just like thinking how delightful something like that would be if it were to exist, right? Like, it definitely lives, I'd say, in like the collective unconscious or the shared imagination of a lot of women who grow up in oppressive circumstances. Right. Like, this is a little bit of our like Shangri-La, or like our little slice of heaven would be to see a culture working this way, the same way Marissa was talking about how Wakanda is for folks of color.
I think part of the way the Greek mythology sparked my interest was less about how the Amazons kind of existed. It was more how they sporadically came up in story. I didn't feel like they necessarily were at the forefront at any given time, but I appreciated how they would just kind of swoop and change a situation. And that was why they kind of piqued my interest. It was almost like the unwanted side character that won, you know?
Yeah, kind of like a trickster, the way you're describing them.
Yeah, they did.
And I like that, because we don't have a lot of female tricksters, and I haven't ever considered the Amazons as like trickster type.
Because I'm just thinking of like the headliners in Greek mythology, you know, they don't necessarily have, I don't know, they don't get to be the spotlight as much as I would have liked. I feel like the males get all the love as per usual, right?
Well, if they're the ones writing the stories, of course they're the ones being the recipients of all the love.
All the love.
All the love. While all the fears and anxieties and hatred are cast upon oftentimes the female characters.
But I feel like that's a thing that both versions of the Amazons have in common, is that they're still the side characters. Wonder Woman and her whole background, it was 30, 40 years before she really had a genuine following as far as comic book characters go. And she still beat Black Panther, right, as far as popularity.
Did she have a TV show in the 70s, or was that just Oh Mighty Isis that I'm thinking of?
Oh, she had a TV show. It didn't run as long as they wanted.
Because she like snapped the bracelets on and then would like transform her
It was
outfit.
a really special, like Sailor Moon level.
Right. Like I'm feeling like it's like a twirl and maybe some smoke or something. And she's like.
But when you think about Wonder Woman, she had like the show in the 70s. And then there's some like animations that she pops up in quite a bit. But Superman is redone like every 5 years. We have a new Superman.
And Spider-Man too.
And Spider-Man too. Right. Like, it just feels like since the comic books came out, there has been a new rendition and a new physical face to attach to the name. You know, so whether we're talking about Greek mythology or comic books, the Amazons they're an afterthought still.
Yeah, definitely side characters, often supporting characters.
I was just backtracking. Talking about the Amazons and mythology made me think that they're only referenced in the Iliad. Priam is telling a story about one of his past experiences with the Amazons, the opposers of men, I believe the Greek says. But I was thinking about, I know they participated in the Trojan War. Like, there are historical poems, or however you want to phrase that, that include the Amazons fighting in the Trojan War after the death of Hector. And I think this part of the story goes that the Amazonian queen at the time fights in Hector's stead, only to later be slain by Achilles, which I think is getting back to this idea that we keep hitting on, which is that the Amazons are these strong, independent, powerful women that have this captivating idea of actually being like beautiful safe haven for women. But you have Achilles, who arguably in the Iliad is the epitome of masculinity, slaying their queen. And I think that seems like a rhetorical device if I ever heard one. Let's have the epitome of Greek masculinity during this time period slay the most powerful of these warrior women.
In Emily Wilson's translation of the Iliad in Book 3, there's a little description. I served among them on the very day that Amazons who rival men arrived. So they rival, assuming in strength and
Yeah.
masculinity and agility as warriors.
I'm trying to think of what the Greek word there is, but I can't off the top of my head.
How dare you?
I know. What the hell? What the hell with me?
Wow.
But yeah, an afterthought. You have this long poem of boys having their feelings hurt and fighting each other and killing each other over it. And the women show up to save the day and they gotta kill them off.
Oh my goodness.
Oh boy.
Are you also an anime person, Marissa?
Yes.
Have you seen One Piece?
Yes.
I was just thinking of, there's the Amazon Lily arc where Luffy, the main character who's going to be king of the pirates, he ends up stranded on this island of all women who they occasionally sail away to give birth, and then they only raise girls. And basically, if any man steps foot on their island, they will kill him. And, you know, Oda is not the most feminist of manga drawers. All of his main character women are super strong personality, fucking awesome, but they're like naked and have huge boobs. It's like pretty annoying. But something that I do appreciate about the Amazon Lily arc is that he does keep a lot of the mysticism of the original Greek myth. These are fierce warrior women. They all have different body shape. They've escaped from slavery, and this is their haven away from men. I don't feel like I get the vibes from it, and I feel like I'm really picky about this kind of stuff, that it is this fetishized, hypersexualized island, right? Like, arguably, the queen falls in love with Luffy, and they're all like, you motherfucking idiot, like, get your shit together, you know? So I just was thinking about that as we were talking about comics, but...
There is a rabbit hole of women-built societies in different... Like, there's One Piece. I can also think of Avatar: The Last Airbender. They have a society of
the Kyoshi warriors.
So it's like there are a couple that have sporadically popped
Yeah.
up and it's kind of like, you're awesome, and they loosely links back to the Amazons for sure.
One of my favorite parts in Avatar: The Last Airbender with the Kyoshi warriors is where Sokka's making fun of these girls for doing what they're doing, and then they're like, oh, and then at the end of it he's like, women are awesome and I am subservient, and he's like wearing the like traditional like female
outfit,
like warrior garb and everything, and he's like, I think that show's so ahead of his time. I could talk about it all day. But I always love
y'all are welcome to. I'm just probably gonna we just want to say thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Marissa. We love you. We appreciate you. We appreciate your perspective. So again, thank you so much. You can find Dr. Marissa Aro at Life Skills Awareness in Hesperia, California. And thank you so much. We love you. Yay.
This was awesome. Thanks for joining us.
This was so awesome.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, on this episode of The Mything Link.
I'm Randall.
I'm Caitlin.
And we will see you next week. Goodbye. Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Oliate and Caitlin Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlin Curry. With music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernweh Collective, Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California. As a small nonprofit, we appreciate if you have the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow our audience. For more information on our organization, head over to fernwehcollective.org. Thanks for listening. Do dogs have service dogs? Dog inception? we're batting 1,000 this morning.
No, dogs do not have service dogs.
Well, they should.
They
Nick
should.
needs a service
Come on.
dog.
Maybe we should start a new company.
Service dogs for dogs.